Welcome everyone to today's discussion. My name is Marianne Hensley. I'm the Vice President of Media Operations here at FreightWaves, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here today with two industry powerhouses to talk about how shippers can utilize data to make the best procurement decisions. Joining me today for the conversation are FreightWaves founder and CEO Craig Fuller and Emerge founder and CEO Andrew Leto, both of whom will be here to address your questions as well during the last few minutes of the discussion today. So be sure to send those along through the Q&A box in your console as they come to you, and we will take some time for those at the end here. If you have any questions on the technical side of things as you listen in today, you can reach out to us via the audience chat function in your console, and we'll be standing by just in case you run into anything. And finally, we will be sending a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow in case you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your colleagues. At this point, without further ado, I would like to welcome Craig Fuller to kick us off.
Marianne, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending this webinar. Andrew, it's exciting for me to have a live webinar with Q&A for the audience to participate. And certainly always exciting to spend time with you talking about the current market, what we're seeing, where it's headed. Tell us a little bit about what you're observing in the freight market as it relates to rates right now.
Well, Craig, it's been total opposite of what this time last year, what happened, what was going on in procurement, because this time last year, shippers were on the other side of the stick here because they had the carriers had all the power. Spot, rates were like going up through the roof. Capacity was crunched. The shippers spot was like 30% of their volume of their total spend. Now it's down to back to 7%. And in 1 year, it's totally switched to where now it's a shipper market. And it's switched overnight. It switched like in April, May of last year. It went like just overnight back to a shipper market where shippers have all the power again. And it's just crazy how that switch happened. And I actually really feel bad what's going on with the rates, because rates have been, especially in the spot market for small carriers. It's almost like, I feel like it's almost like what's happening in the banking markets, where the biggest banks have all the power right now and the small banks are getting crushed. What's happening, same thing for small carriers. The carriers that rely on the spot market, the rates are now below or heading below what it costs to run the truck. And it's how long can these carriers survive? So, this time last year, it was the opposite, right? Everybody's trying to scramble the spot market. Rates were, everybody was making a huge profit. Carriers couldn't buy enough trucks. But it switched. It was like overnight it switched. And now rates, like I see it happening in our system every day. I see the spot rates are so low, and have we seen a bottom yet? No, I don't think so. It keeps, every month it seems to be, I feel like it's going to bottom out, but it hasn't yet. And I feel like are we going to see a mass exodus of small carriers in the next year, of all these small guys? There's over 90 to 100,000 small trucking companies, trucking companies with less than 50 trucks. There's about 4,000 trucking companies with 50 trucks or more in the United States. But there's all these little guys and all these mom and pop shops, and they're really getting crushed right now. And shippers are in control. Most of the freight's back most freight went right back to contract. And as we know, small carriers don't play in this. They don't really get that freight unless they go through brokers, and brokers win those lanes, which we saw that happening. Brokers were winning more contract freight than ever this time last year, and they still continually do, and which is good for small carriers. If a broker wins a lane, that's great for small carriers because that's who's going to be moving that freight. But we're seeing, the rates are getting just so crushed in the spot market that I don't know how much longer, some of these carriers could survive. And I think, that's with any supply and demand market, how does this settle out? How does rates actually go back to a normalized level? Well, that means there has to be less trucks out there, honestly searching for the freight.
So Andrew, you've been around this market for a long time, and you built one of the largest and most iconic names in the freight brokerage industry. This market feels different from my perspective. How would you describe this conditions, this downturn, this sort of pendulum swing, which trucking is notorious for, compared to some of the ones that you've seen in your career?
Yeah, what happened right after COVID was crazy, right? It was nothing like it ever. Brokers, I never saw where, how many brokers got over $100 million of revenue? Maybe like there's 50 different brokers in the United States that, you know, at the height of last year were now over $100 million of revenue. It's because all this freight just swung, you know, after the rejection started happening in the contract market. Where'd that freight go? Well, it didn't go to the big trucking companies. It went to brokers. And then brokers were telling their carriers, their small carriers, you know, selling them loads for over $3 and $4 a mile, where these small carriers are now making a, you know, fortune. Brokers were making a big killing on it. The brokers, every broker grew. I mean, you saw digital brokers just popping up out of everywhere. Everybody's now a digital broker. There was funding for multiple of these digital brokers, and they're all growing fast. We're all, you know, all this freight just swung to them, which was great for small carriers. And that was crazy how that happened. And I hate to blame the government, but that's what happened. The government, you know, wrote checks to everybody. Everybody sat home and started buying stuff online instead of going on vacation. And what happened? They started wanting. There was a lot of demand on freight. Everybody needed to you know, was on Wayfair. Everybody was on e-commerce websites. You know, what happened over in the container market was crazy, and all this freight came in. So brokers are screaming at their carriers, "Hey, buy more trucks, buy more trucks." Carriers were, you know, all these small guys were buying, you know, trying to get trucks. And that was unprecedented to anything that's ever happened before. I mean, everything is, you know, there was predictability up until that happened. And it all is because what happened with the government stimulus. That's what I believe that's caused the problem. It's caused also the problem now with what we're seeing in banking. It caused the problem in trucking. It's the same thing. And that's why I say regional banks are like the small carriers in this sense, like where, you know, they all boomed. They all got massive amount of customers because of what happened, in 2020. And now it's the opposite. Now they're all scrambling, trying to find freight, trying to move trucks. They're hoping that it's just a temporary thing where they're getting rates for under $2 a mile. You know, rates have to be over. When I see a rate under $2 a mile in our system, when a shipper books a truck or with a broker on a spot load for $2 a mile or under $2 a mile, I'm thinking, how is that? You know, hopefully that carrier had another load that got them there that paid them over $2 a mile, because otherwise, how could they be moving this at $2 a mile? But I know if it's a small carrier, if it's a broker, they're using usually a small carrier that typically doesn't have a shipper-controlled lane that's paying them a good rate per mile on the other side. So they're getting bad rates on both sides. How long is that going to sustain to where these carriers could stay in business? That's my fear, is that we're gonna see a mass exodus of carriers in the next few months, like we've never seen in the next year, because we don't see demand getting higher. Demand's not getting much. It's not moving in the right direction for these guys.
So, I mean, volumes are definitely flat, but we've had significant downturns. And even, you know, in your career, and certainly in mine as well, is, you know, go back to 2008. That was a significant downturn for the broader economy, but certainly trucking. We had the downturn in 2015 and 16, the industrial recession. We had another one in 2019. But you made a pretty bold statement that the conditions are worse today than they were back in any of those periods in time. How do you sort of think of that? Why do you think this market is worse than those past markets, which were quite painful for many participants in the market? Yeah,
because as you know, like what happened in 2020, demand for trucking never saw that uptick, and demand for trucks. And we saw that, you know, what happened was, you know, I never saw, like I was at a convention a couple of weeks ago, the Manifest, where I saw there's actually startup carriers there that actually came into the market because of what happened in 2020. You know, these, you know, companies like Variant, and there's other competitors like that were, you know, trying to get as many small trucking companies under their, you know, MC number to move freight. These guys started popping up, and there's all these different, and we never saw an uptick like this. 2007, there was never like this huge demand put on trucking companies and then taken away like that, just like ripped from them, like that's happened in the last 12 months. I feel like there was, and it was all this. It was just literally because the government wrote everybody checks. Demand went crazy, and now it's like the rug was pulled like it's never been pulled, in my opinion. I mean, it's like this is the worst I've seen it, to where it switched so fast. And I don't see it getting better, where the only way to fix this is there's less trucks on the road. But the bigger trucking companies it's not hurting them. Like, I think the bigger, just like the big banks, the big trucking companies, as you can see, the bigger getting bigger, as you know. Like, I heard this, the news today from the US Express, what's, the biggest trucking company just got even bigger, right? That's the biggest trucking company. Now they're even bigger. Now they're going to control more lanes, and now all the freight's back in their pocket, which is the dedicated and contract freight. That's where the freight lies. It went back to them, and shippers are wanting to still limit the amount of carriers they use. They don't want to bring more trucking companies in, so it's going to hurt. Who's going to hurt? It's going to hurt the small guy right now. It's going to hurt the guy, not the 4,000 carriers with 50 trucks or more. The bigger carriers. It's going to hurt the small guys, because that's where the rug got pulled, and that's where they can't find freight. They're not going to go get a 5-load a day or 2-load. They're not going to win the contract freight from the shipper, because the shipper's not letting them in the bids, as usual. So
yeah, it's definitely violent. The peak was incredibly high, and now we're, in many ways, if you think of this as sort of a bender that the market went on for the last couple of years, and now we're playing a massive hangover that is going to take a while. It's going to be very painful. But we, from what I said, we haven't seen a big churn of capacity. I look at, just anecdotal information in terms of the bankruptcies that were reported at FreightWaves. Back in 2019, it was 3 to 5 articles a week at the peak where we were talking about sizable bankruptcies. There have not been sizable bankruptcies and a large number of carriers that have exited the market, at least any of scale. Do you think that's coming, or are you seeing something different than what we're seeing? Because I'm not seeing the massive capacity churn that everyone's predicting.
I don't think,
at least not anecdotally, not from market reports.
You're not going to see it from the notable names. You're going to see it because the freight is fought. Remember, the big carriers play in the contract side market. The small guys play in the spot market, but they rely on brokers to win the contract lanes off the shipper. That's where they get the freight. If because 30% of the volume of the shipper's volume on the contract side goes to broker. So 25-30% of their awards go to brokers. So they rely on that piece of business. Now they're fine there. If they're getting with the big brokers who are winning the contract lanes, they're typically okay, because the rates haven't been crushed in the contract side yet. They're not that bad. They haven't gotten better, but they haven't been crushed like the spot side. So if small carriers could really find brokers that are winning these contract lanes off the shipper, they should be okay. But you're going to start. I don't think it's happened yet. Remember, these small carriers, everybody made. It was only 9 months ago they were making 30%, 40%. They're operating at 60-70% ORs. These small carriers, because they're making so much money on the spot side. And it was a lot of money they made. And I think it's just they're hoping that it changes, but I don't think it's changing. It's not. The only way they could get freight, these smaller guys, is if they go to the brokers that are winning the contract freight off the shippers. Now that hasn't gotten worse, so the brokers are still winning their fair share of the shipper freight. But I don't think you're going to see the big guys aren't going to get hurt in this. It's the small guys, and it hasn't happened yet in a big way. And it's not like you're going to see this in the news when a guy with 5-10 trucks goes out of business or stops buying. You don't read about that. And it hasn't really happened yet. But I feel like, how could it not happen, Craig?
Yeah.
Like, you got these rates. How could they survive?
It's a wholesale churn, right? At some point, it strikes me that there's been a lot of conversation. Look, we were early in the process of calling about the bloodbath is repeating, and the freight recession certainly happened last year. You talked about the fact that it happened in April and May last year. We reported it or started to analyze and talk about the freight recession being imminent in last March. So certainly I agree with you. But one of the things that we predicted that I've yet to see is this quote unquote bloodbath. It is coming. I agree absolutely with you, but I haven't seen it happen. Is it because, as you mentioned, all the small carriers, the predominance of small carriers got incredibly wealthy during the boom cycle and we just haven't seen it? Is it because the equipment prices have stayed inflated and carriers are able just to hand the keys over and essentially get out of the truck payment because of the tightness on equipment? I don't have the answers, but I can certainly suggest that there isn't yet data, at least from what I can tell, And it's certainly not anecdotal information that there's been this wholesale exit.
Not
But I
yet.
think you're right. I think it is inevitable that's going to happen. I think from the question that I have is, if you're a shipper in this environment and you are spent the last 2 years living in sort of hell with supply chain challenges, not able to get your hands on capacity, just service failures that have just become abundant, massive rate inflation, and still couldn't get the service that you need. You finally have a stable supply chain. What the shippers do in this environment? Do they take advantage of these cost deltas and collapsing rates? Or should they stay the course and try to preserve their routing guides with fear that there's going to be a washout of capacity? What are you advising shippers that are thinking about bidding in this cycle? How should they be thinking about it?
Well, we want shippers to run bids. I mean, that's our business, but not just because of that. I mean, if I was a shipper, if I was in the shipper's shoes, why wouldn't you go run all your lanes right now and get a year-long commitment from your carriers? I mean, 3 months it was 3 months. Like a lot of shippers were going in a 3-month bid cycle, which we actually like at Emerge. We think that's actually better for you, because now 3-month cycles actually make more sense for the shipper, because it allows brokers to compete in a big way. Like, a broker can take a risk with their carrier base on a 3-month bid cycle, versus if you go for a year-long bid cycle, the only ones that really could play in that game are the larger carriers. Brokers will do it, but they're taking the risk. But here's the thing: if you give your freight to a broker, a lot of brokers, let's say you do a year-long annual bid, and let's say 40 or 50% goes to brokers, and you think, oh, I just locked my rate in for a year. Well, you really didn't, because if anything changes, we all know that will fail. Now, if everything stays the same and stays course, nothing gets worse or better, or as far as there's no capacity crunch, which I don't foresee happening the next year, then it'll be fine, and your routing guys aren't going to break, and your broker's going to be able to commit to that 1-year contract. But I think 3 months make way more sense, because if you could run a 3-month bid cycle, because you could, again, your brokers everybody could sharpen their pencil a little harder on a 3-month bid versus a year-long. If you're asking for year-long rates, you're really giving up a few percentage points for that guarantee of that year-long rate. But as we know, that's not a guarantee. It's never a guarantee. It's not like I've locked my rate in with the biggest broker, C.H. Robinson, because we all know that the biggest brokers could hold the rates better than the smaller brokers, but when something happens and their carriers are asking for 20% more on a lane, because remember, the carriers aren't committing to the broker that lane and saying, hey, I'll move this for $2 a mile for the rest of the year for you. They're just playing the market. If the rates go up in that lane, then the broker's not going to be able to sustain that rate, and they're going to have to go to their shipper and say, hey, we need more money. So we think that
the larger asset guys had that advantage, right? Because they can bid on the freight, and while they may get it on the rebid, they're less likely to pull the capacity than a broker who effectively isn't willing to lose money on every single transaction.
But if you ran a bid right now, it's kind of crazy. Let's say I'm a big shipper and I run a bid, and I look at who's winning, who's the top 3 carriers in that lane. It's typically a broker right now, because the brokers have all these desperate carriers that are waiting, that are sitting there waiting for freight, that need freight in these lanes. And so but then you're a shipper, you're going to think, well, do I just give all my freight to the brokers and then say, no, you can't do that. That would be crazy. But I think playing part of that is good. Like, you should have a mix. I think 30% is the right number, 30 to 40% of your freight going to brokers in lanes that are, where your carriers aren't, like, if you don't have an asset-based carrier within 5 to 10% of that rate, you should give it to, a broker. If the carriers are within 5%, then you should award it to the carriers, and obviously be loyal to your carriers, and especially incumbent. That's the discussion shippers should always be having with their asset-based carriers, is if you commit to this rate, even if things get better, I'm not going to come back to you and ask for a discount. Now, there's some shippers who do that, which everybody knows the names of them. I'm not going to say them, but some big shippers will go out and rebid. If, let's say, the rate goes down 10%, they're going to go to all their carriers and run a bid and say, hey, yeah, those contract rates we know we could go a bit better. That's not the right way to do it. I think the best way to do it is, but you have to have this commitment on both sides. And usually it's done with handshakes. It's really, I think technology's come into play for that. Like, in Emerge, and you should have carrier scorecards. That should be one of your things. You shouldn't just say, oh, I know that so-and-so held my rates for me last year, so I'm going to give it to them. You should have something that shows you that they did that, they historically have kept their rates low when the contract rates went higher, which that means they're a good partner. And that's how you should judge your carriers. So, income, making sure you have a good scorecard, and then making sure you're awarding to your carriers and having a commitment on both sides. But also, like I said, 3-month bid cycle, and allow brokers to play, because you could do it in a 3-month cycle much better than a year long. And you could really, I think you're going to save more money. If you can run a 3-month bid cycle, if you're a shipper, you're going to save money over time, because, you could easily get 5% better rates by running that 3-month bid cycle, because everybody could sharpen their pencil better. So that's what we think you should do as a shipper, is like continuously run a 3-month bid cycle. Don't try to, do a test, do some of your lanes on 3 months and some on 1 year, and say, and see what the difference is. You'll see a massive difference. You'll see, wow, I could actually save money by doing it this way.
Andrew, you guys see a lot of bids, a lot of bid activity happen across your marketplace. What is the sentiment around contract freight? How has that changed over the last couple of quarters? I mean, certainly we recognize that the spot market collapsed. I think everyone is sort of on to where things are at. But what has been the sort of evolution, say, from the fourth quarter to where we're at today? Have you seen any level of firming in the contract market, or is it still trending down?
No, I think it's not as bad as spot, but it's trending down a little bit, but not dramatic. And shippers are definitely, it's 97% or 93% of their freight is back in contract, their volume. So it's, shippers don't even want to talk spot anymore. That's not where their problem lies. So contract rates, I feel like, is, if you're a carrier, that's where you want to be. Try to get in, if you're a small carrier, try to figure out how I could get to brokers that own contract lanes. That's what you should be looking for. The contract's fine. I think that's not the problem. And I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think that's, because remember, when all this demand happened, this massive influx of freight, all just broke contract and went into the spot market, but that went back down, and now we're just back to the same level where it needed to happen. Like, so think, all that demand really just affected the spot market. Now it's gone, and now it's all back in contract, but it didn't affect contract at all, in my opinion.
So, I mean, a lot of conversation, this sort of evolution of this concept existed when I was dispatching trucks and selling freight back in the early 2000s, is this concept of core carriers, which is the idea that a shipper has a select number of carriers that take the majority of their freight. That got lost during, really, since 2018. We saw that sort of break because of the bull market, and certainly over 2020 and 21. Are you seeing a reversion back to this concept of core carriers, where shippers are now trimming the number of carriers or brokers they work with?
Yeah, and that's the biggest. I can't believe how they're not thinking about it. What happened last year or 2 years ago? When everything broke, and they're like, wait a minute, I only have 20. Think about this, Craig. Emerge has now, we have 5% of all there's 20 billion going to be bid through Emerge this year, which is roughly 5% of all the for-hire trucking. So what we see is, when I look at big shippers, I was so shocked when I looked at their carrier mix, that what carriers do they bring to the bid, and the fact that some of the biggest shippers in the United States, the biggest brands that we know, have 20 trucking companies total that are allowed to access their RFPs. And that's where I was like, oh my God, this is a huge problem, in my opinion, for the market and for shippers, because, if things are fine, it's okay. If everything doesn't break. But when things break, that's where it becomes a big issue. And the shippers that had more carriers during, we saw it, like the ones that had only 20 carriers and broke, let's say 20 carriers and like 3 or 4 brokers. And that's where the average shipper has, honestly, that's even the enterprise, some of the enterprise, enterprise are around roughly 100 total, but the average shipper in the United States has 20 carriers, 20 carriers and about 5 to 10 brokers. That when that broke, and the carriers that were the shippers that won were the ones that had more relationships with carriers, the asset-based providers, because asset-based providers can brokers can't hold the rates, an asset-based provider could hold the rate better. And that's where, and now we're back to this, I feel like they're being short-sighted. They're not, I'm hearing the same thing, which is I'm trying to limit the amount of carriers. I want to limit my carriers. And it's mainly because they don't have the bandwidth to manage hundreds of carriers with tech. But if you have good technology and a good platform and a good way to do your procurement, that's, you can manage more carriers. That's the point of having a system for it. And, most shippers, when I started doing procurement, I was shocked to see that most shippers in the United States use spreadsheets and email. The TMS, which is the execution layer for the shipper, doesn't do procurement that, well at all. Most of the big ones don't have a procurement module. And if they do, no one uses it. And they haven't been worked on in years. So mainly we competed with Coupa and Jagger mainly, but only the biggest shippers use Coupa and Jagger. Most shippers use spreadsheets and email and that's why they have to limit the amount of carriers. You can't run a bid with more than 20 carriers on a spreadsheet and email, an Excel spreadsheet. After 20 carriers, you have to have a system, in my opinion. So they want to limit the amount of carriers, and they're still doing that. They're not saying, you know what, look what happened 2 years ago. Let's let more carriers in. Let's let more eyeballs on our RFPs and our bids, and let's spread our lanes around. Let's not give let's spread it out to more carriers, these contract awards. I'm seeing they want to limit. They want to go back to the old way of doing it, which is, like I said, great for the big carriers. It's great for, this is a big carrier. I feel big carriers, even though they're going to get hurt by the market, they're not going to get crushed by what's happening. It's not like they're going to have, it's just back to, it's swung in their direction, and the shippers are actually going back to that model of, if Swift Knight can do everything, let's give it all to them. Every shipper has this mentality, though, I've noticed, that they don't want to give more than 10%, which is good, to one carrier. Everybody has this unwritten law that we never go over 10% to one provider, which I agree with. You should probably, spread out, at least have that. But you should add more carriers. There's 4,000 trucking companies with 50 trucks or more in the United States, 4,000 different truck companies. And there's always, if you show me I gave my freight to Swift or a big carrier on this lane, there's always a carrier from another shipper that is going there, a good carrier, one of those, even a bigger carrier, that happens to be there. And that, maybe it's not a pure backhaul for them, but you're going to see you could see a better efficiency for the carrier, and that carrier probably needs that freight more than who you're awarding it to. So I think adding more carriers is the right way to go, but we're not seeing that. It's there's going back to the old norm of, we want to whittle down our carriers if we could to 5 to 10. Let's not add more carriers to the mix, but that's not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it is to think about it like this. There's always a carrier that is more optimal for this load, or usually there's a carrier that's more optimal than the carrier I'm using, because there's a problem with data. The problem is that shippers don't really share data. Shippers don't get together and say, I ship all my freight to here with Swift, and you ship all your freight to here with Werner, and you use this small mom and pop trucking company, and they go here, and that trucking company happens to match perfectly with. There's not this collaboration at all where that data is shared. That's what we're doing on Emerge. I feel like we are trying to I look at us as a collaboration tool in a sense, because how Emerge works is you do a bid on Emerge, I award to all my carriers, but now our system knows where all those carriers are going. So when the next shipper comes in and bids, we could bring those carriers to the platform, and they have access to that. They could see that freight, they could access it. And I think just having, being more transparent and sharing this data and then bringing more carriers to the mix is the right move right now. And I hope that if there's one takeaway, if shippers are watching this, that's what you should be thinking. How do I add more carriers to the mix? How do I bring more carrier eyeballs to my RFP? Because that's the best way to, the shippers who pay the best, they're one of the biggest enterprise shippers on our platform. They have 400 carriers and brokers, and they pay 15% below DAT, about 10% better than everybody else. So in other words, they save 10% over the other enterprise shipper that doesn't do that. Think about that. If you have billion-dollar freight spend. That's massive if you could save 10%, 5 to 10%. You know, by having way more carriers and way more brokers and running a shorter bid cycle. Like that's what I wish big shippers would just do is run a 3-month bid cycle, even in this market, because again, you could get better rates and carriers could sharpen their pencils better if you do that. Value incumbency, you know, if, you know, a lot of shippers, what they're doing right now is actually, I agree with, is telling their incoming carriers, hey, match this lane to, you know, let's take the DAT as a benchmark. Just keep your rates where, you know, at market, or if I'm paying 5% below market, keep them 5% below market, you know, because I'm a big, you know, that's what I demand. And instead of me having to go to bid every quarter, just do it that way. You know, like, you know, just keep your rates in line with market. So I think just adding more carriers is the right move, but we're not seeing it. We're seeing the old, you know, we want to whittle down to, if we could do it with 10 carriers, we want to do it with 10 carriers. But when things break, it's going to go back to the same. The shippers that didn't do that are the ones that are going to be better off.
So Marianne, let's see if we have some questions from the audience. This is your chance to participate in the conversation. If you've got questions, Marianne is here to take those. So Marianne, anything that anyone is curious about?
Absolutely. Seeing a few here. Mike says, are we not seeing more customers wanting to leave the contract and run the spot game to win on their side for cheaper costs while the market is light?
You know what? That we haven't seen, which is good because I think that would be a bad. I think one thing about shippers is they do value their carriers. They don't. I haven't seen a shipper, even out of the big ones, that say, you know, screw you, we're going to take all this freight. I'm paying $3 a mile, but I know I can get $2 a mile right now. I'm going to go to those guys and go take that freight to the spot. I'm not seeing that, which is good. I mean, that would be, you know, it'd be great for small carriers, right? I mean, they need that freight, but they know that, you know, the shippers aren't doing that, which is, I think, a good thing.
All right, great. Next question, how do shorter bid cycles affect payables and invoicing?
I don't think it has any effect on payables right now. I think what the biggest problem I see with some big shippers is that, you know, the biggest shippers paying 90 days. Again, that's a terrible move. Some paying 120 days. There's one of the top 10 shippers that paying 120 days. And carriers will say, we don't want that. And then they, you know, but also, which is crazy for the shipper, they don't even use a factoring company for that. You know, if you're going to do that, at least give your carriers the ability to get a quick pay option on that, which would make sense. So if you're going to go to 90 to 120 days, I'm going to pay my carrier. And by the way, I think it's ridiculous they do that anyway, because the carriers are going to bake that in. They might see savings on that, but they're not going to, you know, because they could pay in 120 days and creates this massive cash. You know, if you're doing $1 billion a year, it's $100 million, $200 million that you're creating just in cash. But now you're going to be paying for that. And you're paying 3 or 4% on that money. You just don't, you get it. It's just built into the rates. So I wish shippers wouldn't do that, because they're not thinking, you know, I'm paying for this. I'm just paying for this in higher rates. This money.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Next question here from Holden. What are your comments or thoughts on the impact of shipper-carrier relationships if the shipper adds a system to manage RFPs and conducts bids more frequently?
I think, you know, if shippers run bids more frequently, the carriers obviously don't want it. I mean, if you talk to any large trucking company CEO, they don't like RFPs, which they would rather just have a relationship, and that's what they work on big time to keep their lanes off the RFP events, which again is good for the carrier but not good for the shipper. I think it's better for the shipper to run a bid cycle on everything, including their dedicated private, which they don't do. I mean, they keep dedicated private separate. You know, at least look at the market and use benchmarking if you're going to do it that way. And then hold your carriers accountable to benchmarks. You know, hey, if we're going to use this as a benchmark, you're going to keep your price at this every 3 months. We're going to revisit it. We're building technology for shippers to be able to do that, to say to their incumbent carriers, hey, hold your rates at, every 3 months, just match the DAT mid or, DAT low if they're high demand shipper and they could get away with it. Just match these rates, and then instead of me having to go to bid. But it's always better for the shipper to go to an RFP event.
Great.
Yeah. I say that's about all the time we've got today. So, any last questions?
We've got a few here, but we can respond offline if needed. Let's take maybe one more. Do you think small carriers can be successful in this market?
Yes, I believe so. So at Emerge, that's our goal at Emerge is with the RFP event is to democratize the bid. So right now, if you're a trucking company with 10 trucks, 20 trucks, there's a 99% chance that your freight today is brokered freight, meaning it's coming from a broker and you're not invited to the bid. Now, what we're trying to do at Emerge is allow the small carriers to team together and buy a lane off a shipper. So instead of, you could go in there and then see a lane and then buy it right from the shipper and team up with other carriers, because you can't obviously commit to 4 trucks a day. The problem though is in our industry in general is that, commitments like that, if you're relying on that, you have right now, you can't, remember, we only have 5% of the shippers, so 95% of the shippers, you can't even do that. You have to hopefully get your brokers to win those lanes. If I was a small carrier, you should have a relationship with the biggest brokers that have contract freight. I mean, that should be your biggest question is how much contract freight do you win? Because that's where the freight is right now. And don't limit the amount of, you should work with everybody. You should be going to all the digital load boards, anywhere I could buy freight, you should be in. But right now we're still in an industry where you're locked out of the bid. Unless you have 50 trucks or more, it's very hard to get into a shipper. And honestly, like I said earlier, if I had 100 trucks right now and I tried to go to a shipper right now and try to get on their bid event, the answer is usually no, because shippers are back to the old way. They don't need more carriers, right? Their carriers that they have need their freight. So they're not going back. They're not in this, I need to add carriers right now. So the only thing that a small carrier can do right now is rely on brokers, and hopefully brokers continually win RFP events. Now, that's why I was pushing earlier. I hope shippers run a smaller bid cycle. If you want to save small carriers right now, if you're a shipper, and you should, you don't want there just to be big carriers because your rates, you want this huge market of carriers searching for freight. That's what keeps your rates low, is to go to a 3-month bid cycle, award, and then this way now brokers can play in it and take risks on 3 months. If they win that freight, that freight's now available to small carriers. So I hope that shippers do run a smaller bid cycle. It's better for the shipper. They're going to be able to get better rates if they run shorter bid cycles versus longer. And hopefully that's what they do for the small carriers.
Great. Thank you for that. And everyone, it looks like that is all the time that we have for today. So we appreciate you all so much for taking the time to listen in. Thank you again to our friends at Emerge for partnering with us on today's discussion. And of course, thank you so much to Craig and Andrew for being here as well to share your insights with us. As I mentioned earlier, we will also be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow, just in case you joined us late or would like to share it with your colleagues. But we hope you'll join us again for another webinar very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.